Hello to all, and thank you for coming to this talk. I have long been intrigued by the famous masks that we see popping up at protests across the world and the paradoxes of its present role and its history. I did some investigating, and without further ado, let's explore what I found together. If Claire can confirm to me that the images are shown on the screen?
No, you have to share them. They're not shared at the moment.
Is it up?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you know this image, taken up as it has been by the Occupy movement, by the hacktivist collective Anonymous, as far as I can trace it from the early teens of this century. Here are some examples. The corrupt fear us. We have seen it since during the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Bahrain. The government of Saudi Arabia even banned the importation of the masks, saying that it would confiscate any found on sale, since they claimed it instills a culture of violence and extremism and encourages young people to breach security and spread chaos in society. Still, these masks proliferate, such as in the 2014 and 2019 Hong Kong protests. According to a New York Times article from 2019, they have been spotted not only in the US, but in Ecuador, Ghana, Nicaragua, Germany, Honduras, Iraq, Peru, Venezuela, Chile, Sudan, Gaza, the Philippines, Korea, and here in Europe in Rome, Barcelona, and Paris. More recently still, the mask has even appeared as an anti-COVID mask, which is layering irony upon irony in a world where pandemic masks are highly encouraged at the very least, and thus authorizing a face covering. That face covering is different perhaps in spirit, but not in area covered than some hijabi women's choice of face covering. And that, in the midst of almost mandating COVID masks, these hijabi coverings have largely been rendered illegal in France and elsewhere on the grounds of being anti-democratic. The mask lends an air of Bakhtianian carnival, of theater in these uprisings that aspire to a more democratic world, that imperfect legacy of ancient Greece with demos meaning the people. In fact, the iconic image was chosen for the cover of Alfio Mastropaolo's Is Democracy a Lost Cause? As laboratory for their democracy, the Greeks, our forebears in the polis, cut their political teeth on the theater. In fact, democracy, debate, drama were, as is consensus among scholars, inextricably linked in the origins of the phenomenon of self-rule. I wonder about the mask, given the history of whom it represents, the heavy past burden the mask carries, more on which as we come to it, until such time as Alan Moore and David Lloyd conjured it forth from near oblivion again into the light. The mask might be, even as Pierre Nora wrote in his Theory of History and Memory, put together in the 70s and published in the 80s and 90s, a site of memory or a lieu de mémoire. We speak much of, okay, je reprends. He says, and I open the quotes here, we speak so much of memory because there is so little of it left, he writes, continuing with, our interest in lieu de mémoire, where memory crystallizes and secretes itself, has occurred at a particular historical moment, a turning point, where consciousness of a break with the past is bound up with a sense that memory has been torn, but torn in such a way as to pose the problem of the embodiment of memory in certain sites, where a sense of historical continuity persists. There are lieux de mémoire sites of memory, because there are no longer milieux de mémoire, real environments of memory, close quotes. A site could be a place, yes, but also, and this is our case here, some symbolic object vested with a sense of what is gone before and is leaving us, has left us, at the threshold of forgetting. Or, as Nora says, such sites are, quote, embodiments of a memorial consciousness that has barely survived in a historical age that calls out for memory because it has abandoned it, close quotes. To better understand, we might turn to the historian's comparison. A seashell returned to the seashore when the tide has gone out, no longer quite life, nor yet death, yet we can listen to it and know something of the ocean. Nora famously thought his notion could not be transferred outside of France, but that has been much debated in the 30 or 40 years since his opus was published. And it seems to me that across the Channel, across the Atlantic, and then into the wider world, the Guy Fawkes mask is situated in this interstice, this threshold of remembering and forgetting, which is interesting as the mask has long been associated with a rhyme that begins, remember, remember. The short-term origins, as you may already know, lie in the graphic novel written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd, two self-identifying anarchists, at the same time as Nora was putting together and first publishing his theories on historical memory. This graphic novel then served as inspiration for the 2005 movie V for Vendetta. V is a masked avenger who saves the world, a world which has abandoned democracy and slipped into a fascist dystopia of such horrors as concentration camps. V does so by way of his own terroristic means. V may save the world, but remains all the while profoundly morally ambiguous, damaged as he was by the very horror of the society that produced him. Moore has said, we knew that V was going to be an escapee from the concentration camp where he had been subjected to medical experiments. But then I had the idea that in his craziness, he would decide to adopt the persona and mission of Guy Fawkes, our great historical revolutionary, close quotes. And now we come to the original Guy Fawkes, who has also been called the last man to enter Parliament with honest intentions. Let us set the stage. London, 1605. Catholics under Protestant rule in England had been persecuted for nearly 80 years, just as Protestants and proto-Protestants had been persecuted under Catholic rule before that. Under Elizabeth I, Elizabeth the Great, there were travel bans and bans of assembly on Catholics, and anyone appointed to a public or church office was obliged to swear allegiance to the monarch as head not only of state, but also of church. A Catholic, of course, under the authority of the Pope in religious matters, could not do this. And the penalties for refusal were severe. Exorbitant fines and 2/3 of one's land confiscated. But for repeat offenders, it was worse still. They risked imprisonment, they risked execution. Edmund Campion, for instance, in the 1580s, he had been tortured for a confession, then hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason. Campion cried out that he and his fellow prisoners were as good subjects as ever the Queen had. The reply came in as, "In your Catholicism, all treason is contained." Hanged, drawn, quartered. We know the phrase, we don't always know the reality behind the words. The victim was fastened to a wooden panel and drawn along by a horse to the scaffold, where he was hanged, almost, but not quite to the point of death, then emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered, that is, literally chopped into 4 pieces. His remains would then be often displayed in prominent places across the country, such as London Bridge, to serve as warning of the fate of traitors. When, at Elizabeth's death, James comes to the throne in 1603, he had a more moderate disposition toward Catholics, but within 2 years, events had turned so that he ordered all Catholic priests to leave the country. A low profile, then, religiously speaking, was the key to survival, unless you had big ideas, which a handful of Catholic co-conspirators did, among whom a certain Guy Fox, who styled himself Guido Fawkes, the better to burnish his Catholic credentials. Together they plotted and they plotted until one among them asked, "Shall we always, gentlemen, talk and never do anything?" Do anything meant assassinate King James, along with a whole swath of the ruling class also in their crosshairs, and this by blowing up Parliament. At the last moment, a letter denouncing those plans fell into the hands able to stop this madness. The 5th of November, 1605, authorities found 36 barrels of gunpowder under Parliament with the intent to blow up the House of Lords. And to this day, the English monarch's bodyguards still search the cellars below the Palace of Westminster before each state opening of the Parliament. There was a man with those barrels who, when asked his name, replied, "John Johnson." They took him for a servant. Being taken to the tower and tortured on the rack, he finished by naming names. And this is what the experience did to his writing hand. By which point authorities knew they were dealing with Fawkes. As traitor to the crown, he was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in London. He refused, though their prisoner, to die by their hands. On the last day of January 1606, Fawkes was called to meet his gruesome fate. While climbing the scaffold, however, he jumped. With his neck instantly broken, death was immediate, instead of coming only after a long and grisly inhuman suffering, worse even than what he had known in the Tower. So what do we have in sum? We have a reactionary. By definition, a reactionary is an arch-conservative, a man who wanted to blow into smoke and smithereens and ashes the Parliament. That is the very foundation of the practice of democracy. Moreover, he was a reactionary who failed. It seems an odd choice of anti-hero for a freedom fighter of democratic liberation movements. How did such a transformation come about? That very month of January, when Fawkes completed suicide, there was enacted a law in England commemorating the 5th of November, and this is what eventually became what is known as Bonfire Night, so that these events might never be forgotten. As such, the day was devoted in principle to thanking God for his providentially saving the crown. The message is clear, of course, that Protestant worship was therefore the flavored favor of worship of the Christian deity. And the school children would chant, "Remember, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot." As they would beg a penny for the guy being an effigy to throw up on a bonfire and burn. This eventually entered common parlance as a term for any old fellow, a guy. This is a guy on the bonfire. Now, this became custom in England. But meanwhile in Ireland, outside of Protestant enclaves, the people never fully adopted this custom. That is not surprising for a predominantly Catholic country which never took kindly, and with what reason, to English colonization. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Irish politicians of independent bent were given a sinister Fawkesian look. In 1867, for Punch magazine, Sir John Tenniel, be it said in passing the original illustrator of Alice in Wonderland, since we're a bit through the looking glass ourselves, created the Fenian Guy Fox. And let me show you that as well. The Fenian Guy Fox. Now, this particular cartoon had a very long afterlife, republished as it was with the 1974 bombings of Westminster and elsewhere in England by the Irish Republican Army. Let us change the scene now to that year, 1974. By this point, V is either coming into or gelling in Alan Moore's mind. 24-year-old David Lloyd may even have seen the cartoon as it appeared in a widely circulated newspaper. And at this time across the channel, Pierre Nora is conceiving of sites of memory. Now, were this talk an academic publication, the missing link I would pursue, the avenue that I would seek out, would be the Irish point of view. Did Fawkes ever become a kind of crypto hero, an underground figure to the Catholic independentist cause, trying to overthrow English government for a pro-Catholic rule? The question is particularly apt throughout this period of the 70s and the 80s that were known as the Troubles in Ireland, during which the IRA did everything up to and including terrorist acts of bombing, with the goal of freeing their homeland from English rule as concentrated in the Protestant north of the country. A few other remarks about this period of the 70s and the 80s. Traditional Bonfire Night, with its masks and mischief, was increasingly subsumed into the American-style Halloween celebrated only 6 calendar days earlier. Remember, indeed, when this is precisely the kind of cultural oblivion that Nora was talking about. Yet in Ireland, the holiday was still being used by a minority Protestant ruling class as proof of Catholic treachery. At this juncture in history, the English government was run by the Iron Lady, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was also known as Maggie Thatcher the Milk Snatcher for pinching pennies by eliminating the free milk program for students over the age of 7. This was perhaps the least of the acts that made many say of her that she was the most hated woman in the country. No friend to Ireland's independence in 1984, the IRA tried to assassinate her unsuccessfully. Margaret Thatcher died a peaceful death in 2013, and when she did, when she did, the 1939 song Ding Dong the Witch is Dead topped the song charts at number 2. This is the context that anarchist Alan Moore conceived, wrote, and in 1982 published V for Vendetta in, predicting the world as a fascist horror show in 10 years' time, a world that Thatcherism was inevitably hurtling towards, at least as he and many like-minded people perceived it. David Lloyd, at this period, tossed off a note to Alan Moore with an idea about how they should imagine V. He said, "Why don't we portray him as a resurrected Guy Fawkes, complete with one of those papier-mâché masks, and a cape and a conical hat? He'd look really bizarre, and it would give Guy Fawkes the image he's deserved all these years. We shouldn't burn the chap every November 5th, but celebrate his attempt to blow up Parliament." With hindsight, Alan Moore says of this idea, "All of the various fragments in my head suddenly fell into place, united behind the single image of a Guy Fawkes mask." They could not, however, find one of the old-fashioned masks. It was summer, certainly, but at this point, too, as we recall, Bonfire Night was metamorphosizing into a Halloween and forgotten. Or, as Alan Moore put it, how interesting it was that we should have taken up the image right at the point where it was apparently being purged from the annals of English iconography. It seems you couldn't keep a good symbol down. close quotes. This seems to be something of what Pierre Nora was indicating in the interstices between remembering and oblivion. Yet Moore says, if the mask stands for anything in the current context, that vox populi is what it stands for. This is the people, the mysterious entity that is so often evoked. This is the people, close quotes. V then to the author is vox, that is the Latin for voice, so close in sound to Fawkes, written in the very features of V, his smile, his mustache, grotesque and exaggerated. The V also stands for, as the chapters of the novel unfold, victim, vengeance, villain, vanishing, and more. It even harkens, says the author, to vaudeville, that stage of old, which brings us back to the masks and the voices that bring them to life. For along with vox, there is, the author insists, the populi, just people, persons, a guy, if you will, one of the demos. In antiquity, person, the Greek prosopon, and the Latin persona come from personare, to talk through. It referred to the mask worn over the face by an actor on stage to make themselves heard. For when the demos first started gathering to watch stories playing out before them in the Greek theater, actors wore these face pieces with an emotion etched clearly on the features, so that the guy seated in the very back row could still understand what the actor was trying to convey, be it in the context of tragedy or comedy. In this way, this is very different than the troubling, inscrutable expression of the Fawkes mask, which speaks volumes without saying a word, only smiling. However, like the latter-day example of Lloyd's creation, the features were often exaggerated, grotesque. But perhaps the most significant role of the mask was that of the transformation of an ordinary member of the demos, any guy, who could go through disguise beyond his real identity and become a hero out of myth and legend. This is perhaps not so very far removed from the present fate of the guy mask, the disguise, who morphed from arch-villain on one hand to just a guy on the other, the voice of the people speaking out truth to power with the magic of the mask. It is, of course, a way to obscure and protect identity, a way of creating esprit de corps, but is just as much, I think, a way to transform an ordinary guy into hero, by way of the anti-hero we know from graphic novels and film. The demos, through this mask, seems to have found a voice. When we go to movies, in the intimacy of cinema or even our home television or computer, there is no longer the need for a Greek actor's use of the mask at the theater's origins. The close-ups of movie camera, both analog and digital, preclude that. Make no mistake, though, still, when we do watch a story played out by actors, we are the descendants of that demos, watching stories of, among other things, the fall of tyrants and tragically flawed heroes. Democracy and theater, both Greek creations. Plato critiqued them together, leading us to think that they were connected in Athenian experience and thought. And it has been argued that without Greek theater, no Greek democracy. The invention of tragedy coincided with the advent of democracy in that long ago 5th century before the Common Era. The theater of Dionysus had a similar structure and capacity to the Athenian assembly, and sometimes was even the theater, if you will, of democratic debate. It was through watching these stories play out that theater helped to educate the demos in deliberative reason, critical judgment, and civic values that undergirded political life. Does the Fawkes mask, shifted as it has to the demos itself, protesters who are now at once both watchers and players, does it function similarly? I will leave that question open for your own minds to decide. In closing, however, I would like, looking at the comedy mask and looking at the Fawkes mask to draw our attention to another kind of persona from our deep past of Western democracy, Greek again, and sight of those long gone to Hades. That is the Kouros, the graveside statue of one who had died and yet survived, bearing a smile in the face of death. Remember, remember. I would be delighted to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Vicki-Marie. It was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a few questions. Let me. Okay, I cannot change the image, but yes. Okay, thank you very much for tracing reason of that metamorphosis that you were explaining to us and talking to us about the historical series as well. And I wanted to ask you, do you think people who are using this mask, or even the general public, are they aware of all this past of the mask itself?
Well, I would have to say, to a certain extent at least, because much as the man himself once tried to pass himself off as John Johnson, some protesters in the US, I understand at least in the Pacific Northwest, give the name Fawkes to authorities as an alias, which means they've either read or seen V for Vendetta, and from there they can take it further. I just connected the dots in a kind of preliminary sketch and opened up a deeper time frame that is specific to images and how they function. I've spoken of Pierre Nora's theories of memory and oblivion, but perhaps even more useful here is the foundational art historian Abby Warburg's notions of the image's survival or afterlife. His theories are difficult to sum up briefly, but a good place to start would be Georges Didi Huberman's The Surviving Image, published in an impressive English translation by Penn State University Press. Without dipping into any problematic essentialist views of culture and psyche like archetypes and collective unconscious, Warburg explains how visual motifs travel through time, through a forgetting and remembering that perhaps Nora would be quite comfortable with. In fact, the door over Warburg's famous library, which is now London's Warburg Institute, was engraved Mnemosyne, or memory, declaring to visitors that they were entering into another kind of time, meaning the time of the image is not the time of history in general. It cuts across any chronological schema. It always describes another time, and thus it disorients history and opens it up, making it more complex. Warburg might have said of the Fawkes mask that it has a kind of spectral afterlife, for his favorite metaphor was a sort of phantasmal model of history in which temporal periods expressed by hauntings, survivals, residues, and the persistent return of forms by the unconscious aspects of time, opening up time in which history occurs and explores the paradox of a history of images. Survivals, latencies, returns, all that takes part in the most clearly marked history of phantoms, in the most clearly marked developments of periods and styles. Warburg spoke of his kind of flavor of art history as ghost stories for grown-ups, not conceived in a romantic, fantastic mode, but rather as one would look at a chrysalis and its marvelous process of metamorphosis. And I think that is what we have to do here.
Thank you, Vicki-Marie. We have a question from the public. Someone Cyril is asking, does the Vendetta mask representation create more chaos in this world, do you think?
As I am not personally a protester, does it create more chaos in this world? I feel a bit at a loss to answer absolutely concretely, but I have it from other protesters whom I've interviewed for this piece that it may it does two good things for protesters. For those who don't live in a liberal democracy, it thwarts facial recognition software, and so they needn't worry about reprisals. It also creates an esprit de corps among protesters and a feeling of equality amongst them, at least as it's reported to me, but more chaos in the world. What it can do, other very experienced protesters have informed me, is it can create irresponsible protesting, that is, acting out in ways that are not conducive to the proper rules of the game, and therefore drawing down attention from authorities who would like nothing better than to shut down the protest, even if it be by violent means. So it is a double-edged sword. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you very much. And maybe another one. Would you be able to explain what you meant really by Bakhtinian carnival?
All right, carnival, as many of us know, but some of us don't, it's a period of a festival between the fasting of Lent in Catholic countries. In the medieval and Renaissance era, it was marked by inversions of hierarchies and of masking, a festival of misrule that often coincided with the rioting of people. Mikhail Bakhtin was a philosopher, a literary critic, who wrote his dissertation on the idea of the carnivalesque, in Rabelais, in fact, and analyzed this upside-down world. It was a sort of a temporal parenthesis in which what was forbidden became licit, a time that turned the world upside down in a way that defies formal theorizing. But one element is that it engulfs the participants, and that everyone is a participant rather than, say, spectators watching a parade. And in the participation of this event, a beggar is crowned king, the king is a clown, among other inversions. And I think we can see in these protests that the very inversion of the arch-conservative, reactionary turned rabble-rouser and defender of the people in order to bring about a more just world, that is precisely that sort of inside-out, upside-down, topsy-turvy inversion that Bakhtin was talking about in Carnival. Another inversion that the mask implies is surveillance as opposed to surveillance, that is, watching from below rather than from above. That is, the people are now watching the government instead of the other way around. It was a time, as Bakhtin put it, of joyful relativity of all structure and order. And integral to this was the use of the mask to inversion and transgression, not least of all because you can't be recognized. And it isn't about performance, but rather participation of all. That's my use of demos, if you will. Just a guy or whomever participating in this upending, this transgression of a world turned upside down in the hope of effecting change, even temporary, in the social order. The player, actor, masker, and the crowd, audience, demos have become one. Now, it's also interesting to note that the origins of these theories of Bakhtin's, their backdrop, when the writer was creating his theories, the backdrop was the Great Purges in the Second World War, much like the backdrop for Vendetta was the Troubles and Thatcherism, and much as we see this mask finding its natural habitat in protests against rising authoritarianism. The questions that scholars do debate, however, and this goes back to the question that we had just before, to what extent is Carnival simply a social safety valve, or does it affect real change? Or as Aurélie Godet puts it, can the act of masking in public go from temporary inversion to actual subversion, to the potential overthrowing of the political order, or at least of its main representatives? And this was published in the tellingly titled Journal of Festive Studies. So I hope that makes the reference to Mikhail Bakhtin and to Carnival a little clearer.
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Do you think this mask has a great future ahead with the societies where we live in, where there is a lot of demonstrations, elections coming up, etc.? What do you think? Do you think it's going to be used in?
Well, it's been with us for 10 years now. I think we're always risking saying silly stuff when we start predicting the future, but it's been with us for 10 years, and I think that's more than a fad, 10 years. Will the wind in its sails, will it eventually blow out? I don't think they were used too terribly much in the Black Lives Matter protests. Sometimes, yes. For instance, one of the shots that I mentioned earlier, it wasn't in the diaporama, but one of the shots I mentioned earlier was in Minnesota for Breonna Newsom, protesting her tragic demise. But so not seeing it so much in the Black Lives Matter protests, not being so prominent there, are we witnessing a turn of the tide and the fashion for the Guy Fawkes mask? Is it going to subside into irrelevancy? It's a good question, and without a crystal ball, I'm at a loss for responding.
Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thank you, Vicki-Marie, for being with us tonight on this very interesting topic, very different, and I'm glad you talked to us about it. I'm sure your students, if they were not here tonight, would be eager to listen to you again and find the video on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and hopefully you will come up with another subject of art history, which is also applied to our modern times, and that can be really interesting. So thank you very much, and talk to you soon. À bientôt.
Thank you. À bientôt.